Thank you to the British Council and the Open University for organising this event and for inviting me. I'm not quite sure how you're going to react. I'm not going to be quite as enthusiastic as Michael about English. I'm going to be a little more questioning, perhaps. And I think I'm particularly concerned about how we understand the concept of development. So I'd like to explore that in some detail. I'll also be talking quite a bit about a project that I've been involved with through the British Council in Francophone West Africa over the last year or so. Can you hear me at the back? This covers 8 countries, Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, and Togo. I've been working with a team of 14 colleagues in the region, and we've written a book which I finally submitted at 6 o'clock yesterday morning to British Council Dakar, and it should be launched in Senegal on the 22nd of January. So I'll be talking about that. The outline is quite simple, quite straightforward. First of all, I'd like to explore the concept of development, looking at 2 approaches in particular, the economic view and human development view. Then talk about English and development, focusing on Francophone West Africa. Very briefly, I'd like to talk about aspects which are not widely discussed: language in disaster relief and language in post-conflict contexts. And then at the end, I'd like to tell you a bit about the language and development conferences. I put international there because Beth, I know, likes the term international development. I've never quite been sure what international development, how international development differs from other forms of development. So I thought I'd put it in, but I'm not going to talk about it. It seems to me that there are 2 broad approaches to development, and particularly when people talk about the relationship between language and development, people tend to approach it from two broad perspectives. Firstly, the economic perspective, and secondly, from the human development perspective. There are features of the economic development approach that concern me. My background is pure English, first degree in English language and literature, a master's degree in applied linguistics. So I don't have a development studies background. I'm self-taught and still learning, quite naive. So if you know more about economic aspects of development, please inform me. But it seems to me that one tendency in the economic development approach is to depend heavily on per capita GDP or GNI as the principal indicator of development. For example, we know the UK has per capita GNI in 2011 of $33,000. That puts us, makes us the 28th most prosperous nation in the world. Liberia, right at the very bottom, 182nd from 182 countries, has an average annual income of $265. That gives us maybe a rough idea of the differences between the economies of the 2 countries. But I don't think it's awfully useful. For one reason, these are average figures. Here's an example of an approach which uses this indicator from a forthcoming article by Arcand and Grain. Our chief indicator of development is GDP per capita. I don't think it's terribly useful because these are averages. They don't tell us anything about patterns of distribution within a country. And it's very likely in all countries, but in some countries more than others, there are very wide differentials, gaps between the richest and the poorest. And there tend to be more people at the bottom than there are at the top. So an average per capita figure doesn't reveal that to us at all. It doesn't tell us whether income is being distributed equitably or not. So that's a major problem. Another Another problem is that simply knowing what the average GDP or average GNI is doesn't tell us anything about how those figures impact on people's lives. What do we learn about people's access to education, access to electricity, access to healthcare? We can't get any indication from that sort of number. So depending heavily simply on a figure, I think is not awfully helpful. And particularly if you then go on to try to make correlations between average GDP or average GNI and some indicator of language ability, I think this is getting into the realms of the abstract. I don't think it's really giving us information about how language helps people in their lives and how it might help them to improve their lives. The second tendency of the economic approach is to use the perceptions of small numbers of business people as though they were highly reliable indicators of situations, different aspects of development in different countries. Euromonitor. I've seen one Euromonitor report, 2010, the benefits of the English language for individuals and societies, quantitative indicators from Cameroon, Nigeria, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And what strikes me is that a lot of what's discussed here, even though it is quantitative, it's statistical, but it's based heavily on the perceptions of representatives of 20 or 30 multinationals and other companies that are operating in those countries. I can't help wondering how, if you go to a multinational company and talk to a representative of that company and ask them about the usefulness of English in that country, if the representative of that multinational organization are themselves foreigner, not a national, and you ask them how useful English is, of course they'll say English is useful. It's the only way that they can communicate. Because most people in multinational companies don't learn the languages of the countries in which they're operating. So I have a lot of doubts about the value of simply asking a small number of representatives of business. I gave a talk in Bangalore, I think, in December last year. And there was a representative there was somebody from the British High Commission, Deputy High Commissioner there, who was criticizing whatever I was talking about. And he said, you should talk to business people. You'll get a much more reliable picture if you talk to business people. Well, you get a picture, but it's not necessarily more reliable. It's not necessarily more complete than other sources of information. Another example of this approach is the annual Global Competitiveness Reports published by the World Economic Forum. Governments, or at least some governments, attach a lot of importance to these reports. I know in Indonesia, the Indonesian government is very concerned. Every year, they're published about July, I think. There's a lot of discussion in the press about whether Indonesia is becoming more or less competitive. From this year's report, the UK scored 5.45 from the maximum of 7, and that made us the 8th most competitive country in the world, believe it or not. Right at the bottom is Burundi. Burundi scored 2.78, and that made it the 144th most competitive country in the world. In other words, the least competitive. Where do these numbers come from? They use a very, very wide range of indicators. Couple of hundred indicators, things like infrastructure, the time it takes to set up a new company, how easy it is to sack people, mobility of labor, quality of education. And if you look very carefully at where these indicators have come from, some of them come from World Bank, from other sources, other published research. But some of them, a lot of them, for example, these indicators of the quality of primary education, the quality of mathematics and science education, the overall quality of education, are based on an executive perception survey. In other words, they interview 20 or 30 business people in the country and ask them, what do you think about the quality of primary education in your country? Business people don't know. They're not qualified to talk about the quality of primary education. I mean, they may have opinions because their children go to school, but business people are not the right people to consult about this sort of thing. But these numbers get fed into this formula, and the World Education Forum publishes the results, and governments take them very seriously. We're becoming more competitive, or we're not, or we're becoming less competitive. I think this is dubious. Oh, and another interesting thing is that from their 200 or so indicators, language isn't there at all. So for the World Education Forum, language, English or any other language, doesn't contribute in any way or to competitiveness. Well, I think we would all agree that that's unlikely. Language is clearly highly important in any international trade. One way in which I can see the value of an economic approach, if we look at the question of the language competence of migrant workers. This is something I did a couple of years ago. Well, I just looked at other people's research. There's a very interesting paper by Chiswick and Miller in 2005. They looked at the languages that migrant workers, the language competence that migrant workers have in the language of the country that they're going to work in. And it's not all English. For example, the language competence in Hebrew of people going to Israel, the language competence in French of people going to certain parts of Canada, and so on. And they found that the higher your competence in the host country language when you leave home is a strong indicator of the earnings you're going to receive, the level of your salary after you arrive in the target country. And that seems to be consistent. And intuitively it makes sense. You know, it means you're not spending a lot of time trying to learn the language after you arrive in the country. It's much easier to find a job after you arrive in the country. That's one aspect. Another aspect is, from separate research, UNDP, the more a migrant worker earns in the country where they're working, the higher the remittances they will send back home. This also is intuitively sensible. So that means the home country benefits, some countries benefit hugely from migrant workers' remittances. I think Moldova has the largest proportion of its population working abroad. But Indonesia, for example, earns vast quantities of money from migrant workers working mainly in the Middle East and Malaysia and Hong Kong. So the remittances of migrant workers are extremely important. If we put these two together, then we can see that it would make sense for governments to provide language tuition for their migrant workers before they leave the country. And that will make it easier for them to find work, they will get better quality work, they will earn more money, they will send more money home. So I think here there is a strong economic argument. You would have to teach them the language of the country they're going to. So if Indonesians are going to Saudi Arabia, you would have to teach them modern colloquial Arabic. If they're going to Hong Kong, you would perhaps need to teach them Cantonese or something like that. But anyway, I think in this case there is a relationship. Okay, an alternative to the economic approach is a human development approach, and I think we're all familiar with this. It's the approach that underlies the annual human development reports published by UNDP, and it's also the approach that underlies the Millennium Development Goals, 8 Millennium Development Goals. Some examples from the Millennium Development Goals. One is to improve the maternal mortality rate. In 2009, the safest place in the world to have a baby was Greece. 2 women from every 100,000 live births died. The most dangerous place in the world to have a baby was Afghanistan. 1,400 women from every 100,000 die. In other words, it's 700 times more dangerous to give birth in Afghanistan than it is in Greece. Now, this is the meaningful. This to me is meaningful rather than average GDP or average GNI. When we see figures like this, we can see what development, what underdevelopment means, and where the development needs are. If we look look at the annual Human Development Reports, and you can see very, very clearly what needs are, where they're most outstanding, where support is needed. And all the time, when I look at them, I think in my mind, where does English fit into this? What has English got to do with all these women dying in Afghanistan when they give birth? Not very much, I think. Another indicator, life expectancy at birth in 2011. In Japan, they live the longest, 83.4 years. In Sierra Leone, the shortest, almost half, 47.8 years. Why should people in Sierra Leone not have the same chances as people in Japan? And how could language help to bring about the changes that are needed so that these dreadful discrepancies could be ameliorated? So these indicators enable us to think about the role of languages, including English, not only English, but including English in development. There's a brilliant publication from UNESCO Bangkok, published earlier this year, called Why Language Matters for the Millennium Development Goals. And they go through the 8 indicators, the 8 goals, and explore how language fits in, how language could play a role in each of these indicators. And it's very convincing. They show that you want to reduce the prevalence of HIV. That means you have to find ways of communicating with the people who are most likely to contract HIV. And that means you need to know about the way that the concepts that people have about the disease, about how to talk to them in the language that's most accessible to them. And you need to think about intermediate languages. There's a fascinating article from Burkina Faso, which talks about 3 levels of communication in attempts to deal with AIDS in Burkina Faso. There's the national level advisor, who is from Burkina Faso, but he's urban, he's well educated, he speaks standard French. Then there are the field workers. They don't speak standard French. They might understand it, but they're not comfortable in it. They speak local French, Burkina French, and local languages. And then there are the people in the villages. They don't speak French at all. They only speak local languages. So this article explores the challenges in trying to communicate concepts which may be alien through 3 levels of language, from standard French to local languages. And I think this helps us to see the importance of language in development. Language plays crucial roles in every aspect of development, but it's not always English. The Millennium Development Goals have been immensely useful. They're coming to an end, as we all know, in 2015. Some of the weaknesses that people are becoming aware of are, first of all, the tendency, as we saw at the beginning with the economic approach, a tendency to depend on national averages. So we can see what the average maternal death rate is, but that doesn't tell us whether there's some parts of the country where it's higher or lower, or whether there are certain social groups that are more or less in need. So there are predictions that in the revised version of the Millennium Development Goals, whatever they are, this is going to be addressed in some way, looking at disparities within countries. Another gap in the present Millennium Development Goals is there is no attention to the needs of the elderly, and there is no attention to the needs of the disabled. At the moment, there is 3 national leaders are leading a working party to think about how to revise the goals. One is our own dear leader, Mr. Cameron. The second is the President of Indonesia, Bambang Susilo Yudhoyono. And the third one is the President of Liberia. And we, the people of the world, have been given opportunities to contribute to their deliberations through this, a global consultation on education, the education aspect of development, starting this month and continuing until February. This is organised by UNICEF and UNESCO with funding from the Government of Canada. And there are 4 themes. The first one is it's an online discussion which is taking place from today until the 24th of December on equitable access to education. And then there are later ones on the quality of learning, global citizenship, skills and jobs, and governance and financing. And you can do this through this website. So we can all make our voices heard. Okay. So let's look at English and development now. And as I said before, I'm going to be concentrating on the work that we've been doing in Francophone West Africa. I think that we need to be very critical and think very carefully about precisely where English fits in. We mustn't make any assumptions about the value of English. English has a value, but we need to look precisely and identify it in very great detail. In the 8 countries in Francophone West Africa, we've looked at a whole range. I'm not going to talk about all of them. We've looked at several different possibilities where English might have a role. First of all, there are some multinational companies operating in the region, not many. We've looked at peacekeeping. 7 of the 8 countries in Francophone West Africa are very active, very diligent contributors to UN peacekeeping operations. For some of the poorest countries in the world, I think it's extremely admirable that they're doing this. And ever since the 1960s, since independence, they've been contributing very, very actively to peacekeeping. And then the one that I get most excited about, my friends have heard me talk about this a lot, is the role of market traders in the region. We'll look very briefly at English in schools as a medium of instruction, English in schools as a subject. Right, multinationals. In the whole of there is a company which is a subsidiary of Menzies, the newsagents. It's a British company. And it works in 7 countries in Africa, and it's got nothing to do with selling newspapers. It manages airports. And I was encouraged to look at this company because it's a British company. And I did, and I found that in the whole of Africa, they employ 1,200 people in 7 countries, which means they employ 171 people per country. So maybe if you're going to work for Menzies in Benin, you will need some English. But this is not going to be a huge demand. There's a tiny need there for English, perhaps. It's not overwhelming. Another company, also a British company, Tullow Oil, which is very active especially in offshore oil and gas exploration and production around the coast of Western Africa. It works in 9 countries. It has only 374 staff in the whole of Africa, and that means it employs 42 people per country. Now, if anyone were to propose that English needed to be introduced in primary school, for example, because of the oil industry, this is not realistic. If international companies are employing, at least for the time being, in Francophone West Africa, are employing tiny numbers of people. And I think this does not constitute a rationale for starting to teach English very early. What there is a conventional ESP need for people who are working in these companies, probably. If they've been educated through a Francophone system, they may need English in order to function in these companies. And before we get too excited about mining and gas in Africa, there's a very worrying report from the World Bank a few months ago, which says that it compares what it calls resource-rich countries in Africa, those with mineral resources, and other countries in Africa. You would expect that it's the other countries that would be poorer and the resource-rich countries which would be richer. What they find is the decline in poverty is slower in resource-rich countries than in other countries. the benefits of economic growth in the resource-rich countries don't reach the poorest groups. So there's money, but it's being kept at the top. It's not reaching the poorer people. And issues of accountability, political stability, the rule of law, and the control of corruption are weaker in the resource-rich countries than in the other countries. This is the World Bank. This is not me. So we need to be. We don't need to get too excited about multinational companies working in developing countries, and we can't assume that this is going to lead to widespread development. What the implication of this seems to be is that there is money. There's clearly a lot of money for the companies. There's clearly a lot of money for the governments of those countries. It doesn't necessarily help the development of the countries. Let's look at peacekeeping. The participation in completed and current UN missions since the 1960s. Senegal is the top. It's taken part in 33. I won't read them all. Mauritania participated in 1. And interestingly, these peacekeeping missions were carried out in 24 different countries throughout the world, not only in West Africa. And only 7 of those countries were francophone. So in other words, the military and the police from these francophone countries were working in parts of the world where they needed English in order to collaborate with peacekeepers from other parts of the world, and in order to communicate very often with the local population and the local authorities. Here, I think it's clear, there is, so that these countries can continue and maybe increase their participation in peacekeeping activities, there is a clear need for English. And I understand the British Council in Senegal has recently started a peacekeeping English program for the forces from Senegal, not the other countries yet. Now, this is the one that really fascinates me the most. The economies of the 8 countries of Francophone West Africa are heavily dependent on 2 activities. One is agriculture, and the other is small-scale trading. These 8 countries are among the least industrialized in the world. The trading traditionally takes place across the region, across national boundaries. National boundaries are artificial. There are 296 languages in the region. The implication of that immediately is that people are going to need other languages in order to carry out their buying and their selling when they're trading. We interviewed 85 traders, picked at random when the team members came to a particular town or village. They tried to interview 2 people in each town that they visited, and we got 85 interviews. Only 2 of the 85 were monolingual, so 83 are multilingual. Many of them are uneducated or not very well educated, but they're multilingual. And they do things like buy petrol in Nigeria and sell it in Benin, buy potatoes in Guinea and sell them in Gambia, buy motorbikes in China and sell them all over the region, buy mobile phones in Dubai and sell them all over the region. There is a huge amount of this trading going on. None of it is organized by anybody. Everyone is working as an individual or with his or her father or son or daughter. Many women are involved, so it's real grassroots economic activity. It's very difficult to quantify. There are no national statistics, but everyone agrees that it is absolutely core to the economies of these countries, even though it's not. There are no World Economic Forum statistics for it or World Bank statistics for it. They use 33 in their trading activity. They use 33 African languages and 6 international languages. The most frequently used languages are French. 81% of them say they use French. This is the interesting one. 32% say they need English. The most frequently used African language is Wolof, only 21%. And then more which is used in Mali and surrounding countries. Bamanankan, 12%. Then there's some other African languages, and then Arabic, 8%. Now, we didn't begin by asking them if they used English. We let these answers emerge. Asked them about their experience of trading, where they go, what they sell, what difficulties they have. They all say they have problems with immigration officials, customs officials, and most of them say they have difficulties with language, and many of them say they have difficulties with English. Some of them say they speak English, but not well. Some of them say they don't speak English at all, and they have all sorts of anecdotes, interesting anecdotes about how they get around that problem. Some of them have to recruit interpreters and are suspicious of how honest the interpreters are, because they don't know what the interpreters are saying to the person they're trying to buy from or sell to. Some of them say, especially the ones going to China, they use Malian students in China as their interpreters. Fascinating data. But clearly there is a need here for English. There's a need for French as well. There's a need maybe for African languages, tuition. But there is a clear need for English. And in our report we have recommended that somebody, maybe the British Council, maybe other organisations, could think about very, very simple 5-minute lessons by radio with supplementary support by text message, telling people basic things like how do you bargain, how do you say prices in English, how do you fill in forms in the airport, how do you cajole a customs officer to let you through. Well, yes. That's not the job of the British Council. And here, sorry, not a very good picture. Here's just one of our 85 traders. He lives in Mali. He sells a heterogeneous collection of goods, preserves, bottled drinks, mobile phones, and electronic goods. He travels to Dubai to buy them, and he brings them back to Mali. At home, in his shop, he uses Bamanankan, Dogon, French, and Pearl. When he goes to the Middle East, he uses Arabic and English. He says, he was one of the very few, he said, I have no language problems. He's very confident. And he's obviously doing well. But there are many who have, I mean, some of them have clearly had all sorts of difficulties in their work. I think this would not be a big project, but it would help ordinary people in improving their lives, I think. Okay, English in schools as the medium of instruction. I'm not going to say anything here because there are experts on the subject in the room, like Helen Pinnock, who has written, among many other things, this book, which had a big influence on us, Language and Education, The Missing Link. And the British Council has been instrumental in achieving this statement of principles from the Juba conference earlier this year. I think this is a wonderful step forward. I think John is going to talk about it later in the day, probably, John Nagg. Tony Capstick, who's where? Tony and I have done a little bit in our humble way on trying to encourage debate in Pakistan about the value of using mother tongues as a medium of instruction, particularly in early education. In a situation where Urdu is the official national language, and Urdu is not understood by many people, particularly in rural areas, and where increasingly there is demand for English, because English is the language of the elite and nobody wants to feel left behind. But there is nobody in rural primary schools who speaks English and who could use English as a medium of instruction. And then in Indonesia, for the last few years, Martin Lam and I have both been interested in this. The government has provided huge funding for special elite state schools, which supposedly will be using English as the medium of instruction. And it's led to all sorts of problems because, again, the teachers don't know English. They can't teach their subjects in English. But also it's increasingly leading to social disparities between the urban elites who can afford. They also have to pay fees, who can afford to send their children to these special state schools, and the majority. English in school as a subject. Come back to Francophone West Africa again. There are many problems. English is taught in junior secondary and senior secondary in 7 of the 8 countries. It's taught in senior secondary only in Guinea. There are lots of problems. The curriculum objectives are vague and hugely ambitious. Across the region, teacher absenteeism is about 25%. From our observation, the 25% comes from a government report. From our observations, on average, 19% of pupils are absent. So the actual exposure that children get to any lesson, never mind English, is minimal. The class size is up to 140. 40% of teachers, by their own government's requirements, are unqualified. The outcomes are extremely modest, and you end up thinking, what is it all for? What is the point of all this work going into English when the situation is like this and the outcomes are so minimal? Would it be possible to consider other ways of using the funding that's spent on English, which would be more useful? It's not for me to answer. And here is a classroom in Mali. There are 142 on the roll, and 136 were present that day. Language and disaster relief, very briefly. This is just to point out that these are areas that have not been well explored. At the UNESCO conference in Bangkok in 2010, Tony was there and Helen was also there. There was a stunning paper by someone called Shepard Barron called Language Kills. And basically what he was saying was that when natural disasters occur, action has to be taken immediately. That's very often taken by outsiders. Outsiders frequently have huge difficulties communicating with the local people who need the help, and people die unnecessarily because communication breaks down. There isn't good communication. And he was trying to hypothesize how many interpreters would you need to employ in order to reduce the death rate in disasters. And of course it becomes economically unrealistic, but these are facts, rather chilling facts. Post-conflict context, quite a bit of work has been done in Sri Lanka. One interesting paper by Psyche Kennett, which is in Dreams and Realities, English as a Tool for Conflict Transformation. Okay. Finally, I'd just like to say a little bit about the Language and Development Conferences. As was announced earlier, I'm one of the trustees of these conferences. The first conference was held in 1993, so next year is our 20th anniversary. And our 10th conference is taking place next year. By the way, the website, I tried checking it this morning. It's not working for some reason, but it normally does. These are where the conference has been held. There have been publications from all up to the 2005 conference, Addis Ababa. The Dakar proceedings are underway, and the 2011 proceedings are also underway. Something interesting has happened over the lifetime of these conferences. They began as a sort of celebration of ELT projects, rather unquestioning celebration. As time has gone on, they've become more critical, more questioning. Doubts have arisen. And the most recent one, as you'll see eventually from the proceedings from the Colombo conference, a lot of people have moved away from talking about ELT in development and are talking about other completely separate issues regarding language in development. I think in this volume from 15 papers, only 2 are concerned with ELT. So I think it reflects a growing awareness of the importance of language in development, which is not necessarily English. And I think Oh, and the next one will be in Cape Town. Maybe John, in these conferences we cooperate with all sorts of different organisations, often with the British Council, but also with other organisations, GIZ, IDP, and so on. The 2013 conference is being organised with a huge amount of support from the British Council, and the formal announcement has not yet been made, but it will be in the very near future. And the theme will be opportunity, equality and identity beyond 2015. And the idea is to link achievements so far with the revision of the Millennium Development Goals. So there are two focus areas: lessons as they relate to the existing MDGs, and then the second focus area is the continuing role of language, not just English, in supporting development over the next 15 to 20 years. And then there are 4 sub-themes which we don't need to talk about now. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you for your attention.